Mike has probably read more than anybody that I know, and his enthusiasm for philosophy is palpable. He has particular interests in ancient philosophy, Spinoza, Jewish philosophy, both historical and contemporary, Emmanuel Levinas, and issues in value theory and related areas. He's written a huge number of articles and edited more than 9 volumes in value theory, Jewish philosophy, and the history of philosophy. And his monographs include Dilemmas in Modern Jewish Thought, The Dialectics of Revolution and History, Platonic Piety, Philosophy and Ritual in 4th Century Athens, Beyond Auschwitz, Post-Holocaust Jewish Thought in America, Interim Judaism, On Shame, Discovering Levinas, The Cambridge Introduction to Emmanuel Levinas, Levinas's Ethical Politics, and Fackenheim's Jewish Philosophy and Introduction. He has been granted an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters by the Hebrew Union College and appointed honorary professor at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, Australia. On a personal note, I've known Mike ever since I arrived here as a junior faculty member, and he has always impressed me with his erudition, his fundamental decency, and his good sense. And though he tells me it has never been a particular struggle, he has long been a model for me of someone who is not afraid to follow his interests wherever they lead. So today we'll be hearing from Mike, and then we'll take our customary break, reconvene then for an hour of Q&A. That's the plan. Today, Mike will be talking with us about Kabbalah and philosophy, thoughts on their interaction. So please join me in welcoming Mike Martin.
Well, this is really a thrill to be back. That's a very strange career. It sounds like. I'm not quite sure I can make it all fit together. I haven't given a talk in a while from an actual podium to real people. But as Tim noticed, I had cataract surgery, so I can see you all well, but I can't see on the paper. I'll do the best I can with the glasses, and then when I peek up, I'll take them off. I hope the paper won't be too terribly long. I've made some cuts, and I may have to make more. Along the way, I'll refer to the handout where there are a few of the readings, and in one case particularly, the readings are from a work that I'm pretty confident nobody in the room has ever seen and probably not heard of. So it's a good thing to have at least a few texts. So here we go. In recent years, there have been several attempts to argue that Spinoza was indebted to the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah. I'm not going to add to these remarks in my comments today. Rather, I want to explain how the question of Spinoza's debt to the Kabbalah is an interesting philosophical as well as historical question, and to make some suggestions about how one might approach it. The association of Spinoza with the Kabbalah is an intriguing and even puzzling issue. We think of Spinoza as a classic modern rationalist, a Cartesian, a scientific naturalist of sort. What would such a figure have to do with the diverse expressions of Jewish mystical speculation and esoteric lore that had strongly magical and occult dimensions? In fact, in his most famous comment on the Kabbalah, in his theological political treatise, Spinoza speaks with just this kind of disdain. Why think the truth is otherwise? In order to clarify what I have in mind, I'm going to have to say something about the Kabbalah and how it came to be associated with Spinozism and Western philosophy. I'll get to that in a moment. What I say will be largely expository and historical. After I set out these matters, I'm going to turn to a later occasion when Kabbalah and Spinozism were drawn together. This occasion took place a century after Spinoza's death and involved a contemporary of Kant's, Solomon Maimon. After I discuss Maimon's philosophical reading of the Kabbalah, I'll turn back in time to an important philosophical Kabbalistic work written in Amsterdam, and a work that might well have been known to Spinoza. My purpose in juxtaposing Maimon and this earlier work by the Kabbalist Abraham Cohen de Herrera is to illuminate how Spinoza might have reacted to Herrera's overall account. But I don't want the philosophical payoff of these comments to be camouflaged by all the historical background, so to speak. So let me set up a signpost, as it were, by saying a word about how these encounters between the Kabbalah and philosophy might be viewed. Solomon Maimon was an East European Jew, basically self-taught, who from childhood had a passion for scientific and philosophical thinking. He lived an impoverished and itinerant life in Europe, on 3 occasions finding his way to Berlin, where he became a friend of Moses Mendelssohn's and other German intellectuals and philosophers. He taught himself Spinoza, Leibniz, and Hume, as well as others, and was introduced to Kant's first critique in the late 1780s. In 1792 to 1793, he published the work for which he became best known, his autobiography, and in the course of it, he examines his commentary on Maimonides' God for the Complex, and also his reactions to the Kabbalah. In his afterword to a recent new translation of this work, Gideon Freudenthal places Maimon's reading of the Kabbalah within the context of his critique of Kant. And Freudenthal has this to say, and that's the first reading on the handout. It's on page 1. So let me read quickly through it with you. The only way to answer the quid juris question, Kant's question about justifying the objectivity of our experiences and synthetic a priori judgments, in a satisfactory way, is to dissolve it. That is, to conceive of the human mind and of God as substantially the same as the sensible world. In his German period, Maimon believes that the quid juris question is one and the same as the important question that has occupied all previous philosophy. The problem has changed, though. In Kant, it addressed the distinction between concepts and intuitions, a priori on the one hand, and experience a posteriori on the other. In Maimon, it addressed the distinction between an immaterial intellect and intuitions as such, whether a priori or a posteriori. What seemed to be the same problem in a broader sense, in fact, modified its meaning, such that its resolution, in Maimon's words, leads either to Spinozistic or to Leibnizian dogmatism. Maimon assimilated the Kantian problem to his own philosophy, formed on the basis of tradition Aristotelian and Neoplatonic metaphysics. Both the Leibnizian and Spinozistic resolutions of the form-matter, or understanding and intuition concept and object problem, consist in showing that these are not different in kind. Spinoza supposes that one and the same substance is the immediate cause of all effects. Every particular effect in nature is ascribed to the first cause. By contrast, in Leibniz, all specific phenomena are drawn into an immediate relation with specific causes, but the different effects are conceived of as belonging together within a single system, while the cause of the connections among a variety of things is sought in a being that is outside the system. In both philosophies, the seemingly heterogeneous realms are homogenized with reference to their common origin. But the Leibnizian and Spinozistic resolutions do differ. One difference is that the first cause is transcendent according to Leibniz, immanent according to Spinoza. Maimon's first addition to the quid juris question arises here. How can a transcendent, immaterial intelligence create a material world? Or how can an object of intuition be constructed from a concept? In Spinoza, this problem does not arise, as there is no creation, and God and the world are one and the same. Well, this is Freudenthal. After setting out this context, he then goes on to point out how Maimon himself had noted how his reading of Spinoza is these are Maimon's words, very deep and agrees with Kabbalah. As Maimon puts it, back in Poland, I had, through my reading of Kabbalistic writings, chanced upon the same ideas that underlie Spinoza's system. Citing Mendelssohn on Spinoza, Maimon summarizes the insight of Spinozism as all is one and one is all. The core of Spinozism, he said in his autobiography, is the doctrine that all objects are manifestations of a single substance. Following Freudenthal's reading of Maimon helps us to understand the context for Maimon's interpretation of the Kabbalah. In short, to use terms that Paul Franks has used in examining German idealism, it helps us to understand why the monisms of Spinoza and Leibniz appealed to Maimon, and how their monisms and holisms differed. In his youth, Maimon came to the Kabbalah as someone familiar with the Bible and Maimonides. Later, having studied Hume, Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant, he reframes the issue facing them in terms of what he takes to be a perennial philosophical problem. And in that light, his early reading of Kabbalah and its relation to Spinoza takes on a very specific shape. In short, no simple consideration of borrowed terms, expressions, or concepts gives us sufficient insight into Maimon's reading of Kabbalah. A much deeper grasp of his philosophical motives is required. With these matters in mind, let me say a word about the Kabbalah, what role it played in Spinoza's Amsterdam in the 17th century, and how Spinoza himself, after his death, came to be associated with it. Kabbalah, the word, the concept, refers to the tradition of mystical writings and practices in Judaism. By the early 17th century, the dominant and most creative development within Kabbalah stemmed from the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, who taught in Safat, in Palestine at the time, who taught in the mid-16th century, and his disciples Chaim Vital and Israel Sarug. The Lurianic cosmology is grounded in a supreme divine principle, the Ein Sof, or unlimited, and its creation narrative invokes the divine light, which through a process of outpouring becomes manifest in 10 sphirot, which might be thought of as circles of light, or divine attributes, or numbers or measures. These come to be in Lurianic Kabbalah, configured first as a primordial man, Adam Kadmon, which then comes to incorporate 5 different configurations, what are called partsufim, and then through a complex series of processes and of worlds, 3 of them spiritual worlds, finally emerge in the sensible material world in which we live. Now, I couldn't find a diagram of the entire Kabbalistic system, but on page 2, there's a picture frequently used in the model of a tree of the 10 sphirot, which I won't say much about in any detail, but they're structured so that the highest one is closer to the Ein Sof, the hidden divinity. And the bottom one, Malchut, also called Shekhinah, that is kingdom or divine presence, is at the bottom. And this configuration occurs first in the primordial man, then it occurs in each one of the worlds. And there's a world of emanation, a world of creation, a world of formation, and then finally the world of human activity and activity generally, which is our world. So that's just to give you a sense of how this is frequently depicted in Kabbalistic writings and such. Now, Luria, one of Luria's students, Isaac Sarug, was known for being somewhat more philosophical rather than representational. The Sarugian version of this Lurianic Kabbalah includes the important process at the very beginning of divine contraction and concentration. The Hebrew word is tzimtzum, together with an elaborate set of arrangements of divine points formed into letters prior to the expression of these sfirot in the form of Adam Kadmon. This basic cosmological framework occurred in a variety of forms and versions, especially during and after the 13th century, and most frequently in the course of elaborate commentaries on the biblical text, and on an ancient work that the earliest evidence for which we don't have until about the 9th century, entitled The Book of Formation, or the Sefer Yetzirah, which itself was a commentary on the creation narrative in Genesis. A peek in the elaboration of this cosmological picture, this Kabbalistic picture, the Zohar, a multi-volume vast work in commentary form, was produced in Spain in the 13th century. All subsequent Kabbalistic speculations elaborate upon and build upon the foundation of the Zohar, which itself is a commentary. Now, while the tradition of Jewish mystical thinking has its origins then in antiquity, the modern developments of this tradition go back to the 13th century. One of the important periods when the Kabbalah and Western philosophy engaged with one another was the early 17th century. And perhaps the most important manifestation of this interaction was a massive work on Kabbalah and philosophy. In its Spanish original, it comes to about 400 pages. In the English translation, it's about 500 pages. That was published by Abraham Cohen de Herrera, and it was in Amsterdam in 1632, entitled Gate of Heaven. That work was then abridged and translated into Hebrew in 1655 by an Amsterdam rabbi and Kabbalist, Rabbi Isaac Aboad de Fonseca, who was one of Spinoza's rabbis in the Amsterdam synagogue, and also, as it happens, he was a member of the rabbinic court that excommunicated him. The association of Spinoza with Kabbalah was stimulated by the publication of a library of Kabbalistic works in Latin translation, the Kabbalah Denudata, in 1677 to 1684. That a set of translations into Latin of Kabbalistic works and works in Christian Kabbalah, done by a team headed by Christian Noor van Rosenbrock, including the alchemist and occultist Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont, who was a close associate and friend of Leibniz's, and also Henry Moore and Conway. This collection, the Kabbalah Denudata, made Kabbalistic texts available beyond scholars and devotees to a wide public and facilitated new discussion of what it was and its relationship to Judaism. The Kabbalah Denudata then was really a library containing Zoharic material, full texts of portions of Zohar of Kabbalistic writings, and much Lurianic Kabbalah and the Latin it also included a report from Henry Moore Belmont as well. Now, one of von Rosenthal's collaborators on this project was a man named Johann Peter Spaeth. He converted to Judaism after the project had been completed and became a rabbi in Amsterdam. His name changed to Moses Germanus. In a debate with him in 1692, an itinerant Christian theologian and Kabbalist person aware and knowledgeable about the Kabbalah, Johann Georg Wachter, wrote a work entitled Spinozism in Judaism, or the Divinized World in Contemporary Judaism and its Secret Kabbalah, to Moses Germanus, born in Augsburg. Wachter reported conversations with Spaeth, or Germanus, in Amsterdam, in which Wachter argued against Spaeth's conversion because Judaism, he argued, was basically Kabbalah. Kabbalah was identical to or like the philosophy of Spinoza. And Spinoza's philosophy, of course, was thought to be an atheistic materialist work. Wachter drew upon Moore's summary of the Kabbalah, especially the principle, nothing can come to being out of nothing, and also on the work entitled Porta Caelorum, a summary translation in the Kabbalah Menudata of Cohen, Avram Cohen de Harar's Gate of Heaven. It was then Wachter's account of Spinoza and Kabbalah, done around 1699-1700, that resurfaced in the late 18th century in the anti-rationalist writings of Friedrich Jacobi, broadly speaking, as an aspect of the famous Spinoza controversy. Excellent accounts can be found in our once colleague Fred Beiser's The Fate of Reason and elsewhere. And Paul Franks has explored Jacobi's step to Wachter and this whole tradition of reading Spinoza as a Kabbalist in some really excellent articles. But for our purposes, this is plenty, probably more than necessary. And with that, let me now turn back to Maimon. And here I'm going to be saying something about the texts on pages 3 and 4 of the handout. In chapter 14 of his autobiography, Maimon recalls his fascination as a teenager with the Kabbalah and his introduction to it. In the course of his account, Maimon sketches the cosmogony of the Kabbalah and explains how he sought to interpret the central Kabbalistic narrative of the earliest stages in the emanation of the cosmos from its original first principle, what the Kabbalists call Ein Sof, the unbounded, and what Judaism has called God, to the relation of all things to him, the highest being. Maimon explains that originally the Kabbalah was apparently nothing but psychology, physics, ethics, politics, and the like, presented through symbols and hieroglyphics in fables and allegories, the secret meanings of which required special knowledge and ability. Over time, the secret meanings were lost, and all that was left was an elaborate system of linguistic and numerological manipulation. It was to this system and its practical magical implications that Maimon admits he was introduced and which left him unsatisfied. These frustrations led him to seek a different approach to what he thought was deep down a science of the secrets of nature, to use his words, and which could, if understood properly, lead to rational knowledge. Maimon then, in the autobiography, gives an example of what he had accomplished. What he claims to have done is to think through some central metaphysical and physical ideas on his own, and in this way to explain what the Kabbalah meant by its first principle and how that principle was related to all things in the cosmos. Maimon then gives the following account, a kind of paraphrase of the Kabbalistic narrative of creation via emanation, and that's the first reading on page 3, reading A. Before the world was created, they say, the divine being occupied the whole of infinite space to the exclusion of all else. But then God wanted to create a world to reveal those of his properties that were intended for beings other than himself. To this end, he withdrew into the midpoint of his perfection, whereupon he sent into the empty space he had thus created 10 concentric circles of light. From these emerged various figures or configurations, parts of theme, and gradations, that different series of worlds, all the way to the sensory world of the present moment. On the last page of the handout, if you flip over, I actually give the first paragraph of Chaim Vital's account of the Lurianic Kabbalah in his work Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life. And then under it, there's a little diagram that people always seem to make when they, when there's a translation of Vital, of this circle with a point in there.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Now, let me now say a few words about this first comment on Maimon. The 10 circles of light that Maimon referred to are the Spirot, the 10 divine lights, numbers, or attributes that are present in various forms in the early Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, in other early Kabbalistic works from the 13th century, in the Zohar, and frankly, in just about all Kabbalistic cosmologies. The highest principle or Ein Sof is infinite and perfect. Creation is an act of will of this infinite being. But before the 10 circles of divine light can be projected into the empty space, that venue had to be created. And Maimon calls this process, using the Kabbalistic and rabbinic expression for contraction, concentration, or withdrawal, tzimtzum. Divine contraction or concentration then is if not the most complex, ambiguous, and yet fruitful Kabbalistic notion that's come down from the Lurianic Kabbalah, it's certainly one of them. Without any explanation, it's unclear how the concentration into a midpoint also brings about an empty space. It's within that point, however, that the Sfirot are somehow projected and take the forms of the supernal configurational parts of theme, the several spiritual worlds, and then the world in which we live. Maimon's first comment about this sketch is that it is most likely taken literally, most commonly taken literally, but that he does not see how it is possible to do so. And he gives 3 reasons why the literal reading should be rejected. I'm going to pass over those for the sake of economy, but one of his reasons is that he doesn't see how creation can occur because prior to creation, there is no time. Creation is supposed to have taken place in time. This is a standard argument that goes back in the Middle Ages to the early Middle Ages, and even has its origins, those of you may remember, in Parmenides, right, in the B fragment, in the argument about the Eleatic monism as one denial of the coming into being of being itself. A second reason, he says, is that God is supposed to have been taken all space, but there can't be any space, right? And such. He has his 3 reasons why it shouldn't be read literally. He then describes his thinking, which he intended as a philosophical or scientific interpretation of what this Kabbalistic narrative means. And that, on your handout, takes us page 3 to citation B. God is not prior to the world in terms of time, but rather in accordance with his being as a necessary condition of the world. All things outside of God are necessarily dependent upon him in both their essence and their existence. Thus, the creation of the world can be conceived neither as bringing forth something out of nothing, nor as the formation of something independent of God, but only as a bringing forth out of God himself. And because beings are of different degrees of perfection, we can only suppose to explain their genesis as restrictions of different degrees of God's being. Because this restriction must be conceived of as extended from the infinite being to materiality, we must imagine the beginning of the restriction figuratively as the middle point, that is the lowest point of infinity. Well, let me stop here and explain, say a word or two about this first step in Maimon's reflection on the Kabbalistic account. He begins by positing, as it were, God and all finite things other than God. These finite things are dependent for what they are and that they are on God or Ein Sof. And creation cannot be ex nihilo, nor can the effects be wholly independent of God. Rather, the production of these finite effects must be emanated, or a kind of projection out of the divine being. Moreover, given the existence of both, he asks, what does it mean to say that God is prior to these things? He rejects temporal priority, proposes what we might call ontological or metaphysical priority. All cosmic things depend upon God. God is the necessary condition of the existence and essence of what is other than God. Therefore, as I've said, all cosmic things are not independent of God, nor are they craved by God out of nothing, insofar as there is no existence nor temporality outside of God. Rather, finite things are dependent upon God as their necessary condition, only insofar as they are conceived as deriving from God himself. Moreover, since beings or existing things are of different degrees of perfection, that is, since their properties are realized to greater and lesser degrees, the emergence from God, who is perfect and without limit in every way, and thus beyond predication or determination, should be conceived as a series of restrictions stretching from God's infinite and perfect being to materiality, or the realization of physical property. And if the one extent of this series of restrictions must be conceived of as God, the other extent might best be conceived figuratively as a point within God that is lacking in all the perfections or properties, that is, as the middle or lowest point of infinity. This point is the ultimate locale or location of what would be prime matter, figuratively speaking, produced by the first and most radical act of self-restriction by God. The bringing into being of this point and the vacating of it is what the Kabbalists called tzimtzum, or divine contraction. In short, the description of this divine action is a figure or allegorical expression for the ontological and metaphysical dependence of all finite things on the perfect infinite ground or cause of all being. Now, the next step in Maimon's account is to say something about what the Kabbalists call these sphirot, the 10 attributes or measures or numbers that are the ways in which the levels of perfection from the infinite divine being emerge or emanate from the divine being as a multi-stage process of self-limitation. Maimon continues his account this way, and this is C on page 3. As the ultimate subject and the ultimate cause of all beings, God is the Ein Sof, the infinite, about which, taken as such, nothing can be predicated. Yet, when it comes to the infinite beings, positive properties are attributed to him. The Kabbalists have reduced these to 10, which they call the 10 sphirot. In itself, then, Ein Sof or what Maimon takes to be the highest subject and cause of all things, has no names and can be ascribed no predicates, has no properties, as does, for example, the one in Numenius, Plotinus, Proclus, and Neoplatonism more widely. But when Ein Sof is conceived in terms of its relations to the infinite existent things dependent upon it, predicates or attributes are ascribed to this principle. And the Kabbalists in the Zohar, in Moses Cordovero, who was Isaac Luria's most prominent predecessor and Sfat, and in Luria himself and his disciples, they all call these predicates or categories of predicates spirot. But Maimon asks, what is the relation between these spirot and the Ein Sof? Are they the divinity itself, or something other than the divinity? And this, by the way, is a problem that famously Cordovero spent a great deal of time thinking about, and he was philosophically inclined as well as some later figures. In an aside, Maimon comments that, in his words, the Kabbalah is in fact nothing other than an extension of Spinoza. End of quote. For it not only traces the world back to its genesis in the divine being's restriction, and therefore divine being's substance, but also, in his words, traces the genesis of every kind of being and the relation of each to the others back to a particular property of God. What the Kabbalah calls spirot, then, Spinoza, we might imagine, Maimon's reading, Spinoza calls attributes, or perhaps infinite modes. And Maimon's question and comment apply to Spinoza as well as to the status of the attributes in Spinoza as well. Now Maimon takes up this problem, whether spirot are Ein Sof or the highest divinity or not, indeed whether they are real or not, and uses a reading of the Aristotelian categories, which he found in Maimonides' guide, most likely in his discussion of divine attributes, to show how the categories differ from the existing things they apply to. And that this is a problem. So Maimon first says the following, and this is D on your handout. The book of Pardes, which is a work called Pardes Rimonim, and it's the most prominent work. It's a multi-volume, 30-volume work by Moses Cordovero. The book of Pardes by Rabbi Moses Cordovero examines the question of whether we should regard these spirot as the divinity itself. And then he makes this statement that is very bewildering at first glance. It is easy to see, however, that this investigation is no more difficult when carried out with respect to the divinity than with respect to any other being. Now, I take it that Maimon here is claiming that the problem of how the attributions of God are related to God is no more challenging than the general problem of how predicates about an object are related to that object. That is, if the spirot are the way that God or Ein Sof is conceived or understood, how are such predicates or properties related to them? And is this relation between an object on the one hand and how that object is conceived or understood a wholly general problem, as true of particular existing things as of God? Now, Maimon's point seems to be that the route to solving Cordovero's metaphysical problem about God and the spirot is through clarifying the general problem of how knowing and experiencing an object is related to that object's objective condition. Now, Maimon recounts the clues that pointed him in the direction of a solution to the problem. Cordovero and the other Kabbalists took there to be 10 spherot. Now, of course, there were substantive reasons for these Kabbalists to identify the number 10 as specific, and specifically the 10 as Maimon knew them. And these reasons no doubt had to do with some awareness of, say, Neo-Pythagorean developments in antiquity and the nature of the number of tenets of perfect number and so on. But the number itself and the way he refers to it clearly made him think of Aristotle's categories, the list of which he had most likely learned from the Hebrew translation of and notes to Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, that had been written in Arabic but translated by Samuel ibn Tibet, who added notes to his translation. The notes were translated, were published in the 1743 edition of Maimonides' Guide that Maimon no doubt now knew and had studied. That is, Maimon refers to these categories as the most universal predicates of things. For example, substance, quality, quantity, and so forth, without which nothing can be thought, he said. Moreover, he goes on to say, these categories are logical forms that refer to a real object, and without which that object cannot be conceived. That is, as Maimonides then says, these categories, and in his words, are grounded in the subject, but only through their relation to a real object do they become an object of consciousness. Now, here it is tempting to remember that by the time Maimon had written his autobiography in 1792, he had already read and studied Kant, his first critique, and the role of the Kantian forms of intuition and category. That he had done in 1789, and in 1790 he had published his famous essay in which he delivers a critique of Kant, among other things, on the issue of the relationship of the forms of intuition to the categories of the understanding. He'd also then, by this time, also arrived at what he had called earlier in his comments a broad understanding of the problem of quid juris, and the question how understanding and sensibility could be related in Kant, and thus how form and matter, a priori categories, and empirical knowledge, and more could be related. Thus, to Maimon, the categories are conditions of cognition for the experience and knowledge of objects. And the hint from Aristotle then thus also points to Kant. This point is the salient one. The categories are grounded in the subject, and yet true of objects in nature. And in this Kantian spirit, what applies to the categories of our consciousness of all objects also applies to God in those categories, when they are conceived as God's attributes or properties. Moreover, all finite things with all their predicates or properties derive from God, as do all subjective perceptions and judgments about God and the world. But whereas we finite beings only have incomplete knowledge or awareness of the application of these categories to worldly things, God has an infinite and complete knowledge of them. As Maimon says, and I quote from him, the Sphirot belong to the Ein Sof itself, but their reality is revealed only through their particular relation to and effect on objects in nature, and whose number can be variously determined from different perspectives. That is, different perspectives to us, but an infinite perspective to God. So that's Maimon on the Kabbalah. With that as background, now let me turn to Herrera. I had it in my mind that this is what I really wanted to do, but it just wouldn't be interesting to you if I started with Herrera, right? Because Herrera is a different kettle of fish. He's a different kind of person, and his work is a different kind of work. It's very syncretistic rather than critical. And it uses philosophy extensively to help construct a picture, an interpretation, what we might call a philosophical elucidation or redescription of the Kabbalah. But he doesn't do it in the way that Maimon does. But having looked at Maimon, we can then, at the end, ask of Herrera what his philosophical motives were for doing what he does, which he does very unclearly.
Hmm.
Now, gate of heaven, as I mentioned, Shar Shemayim in Hebrew, Puerto del Carlo in Spanish, is a very large work. So I'm going to begin with a bit of an overview, since I assume you don't know much about the work, and frankly, the structure of the work isn't terribly obvious by reading it. It has 10 books. The books are divided into chapters. The chapters are frequently 2 or 3 pages long. The chapter with the least, the book with the least number of chapters has 7 or 8. The first chapter has 40. The first book has 45 chapters. So it's a book of very differing degrees, does different things in it, and he's using philosophical material sort of all the time. In book 1, Herrera gives an account of Ein Sof. He starts with the highest first principle, which he generally refers to as the uncaused and necessary first being or principle. And then he introduces this Sphero. Now, I take it that this is a kind of first pass, looking at the Kabbalistic account of creation that also presents us with the structural components of the Kabbalistic cosmology. In book 2, he elaborates this account by adding in much of the Lurianic apparatus. And one of Luria's great novelties that probably didn't come out what I've already said is that he took a Kabbalah in which Ein Sof, the divinity, and then the Sphirot as these first emanations of the 10 principles, call them or whatever, and he elaborated a whole network of imagery before that first emanation takes place. And that's what Herrera does in the second book. He adds all of this in. So he adds in the Tzimtzum, the divine contraction, the divine identification of a concentration into a point, contraction, however that's to be conceived, etc. We'll come back to that later. And then he adds into it a whole array of, I don't know what we call them, kind of a metaphysic of points, numbers, lines, figures, and then letters that come to him through the Kabbalistic tradition, which are very prominent in other traditions in the Middle Ages, of course, and in some ways go back to Neo-Pythagoreanism, at least some. That he does in book 2. Book 3 through 7 are what I'm going to call the philosophical core of the work. I'll come back to that. Following book 7, in book 8, he demonstrates how the Lurianic picture that he has developed in the philosophical core is grounded already in the Zoharic literature of the 13th century, and then in that earlier book, the Book of Formation. In books 9 and 10, he addresses a host of technical controversies about the details of the Kabbalistic cosmology. These are kind of internal to Kabbalistic vocabulary about different features of the process. Okay. A lot of it has to do with the numerology and such things. Right from the very beginning of the work, Herrera employs philosophical terminology and concepts, along with the widely employed variety of Kabbalistic expressions for central cosmological entities. But the fullest defense comes in those internal books, 3 to 7. And that's why I want to focus on those books. Book 3 introduces a threefold distinction that goes back at least to Avicenna, and that Herrera may have adopted from Maimonides, who was indebted to the Arab philosophers of Vajra, Al-Farabi, and Avicenna, and very likely Avicenna on this particular issue. The threefold distinction is a distinction among things, or we could say beings, I suppose. And that is, it's a distinction that each and every being is either necessary in itself, or possible in itself, or possible in itself, but also necessary insofar as it is dependent upon another as its cause. Now, actually, there's a thoughtful distinction because there are obviously things anyway, not beings, things that are impossible, right? But he ignores that. No, he doesn't take that seriously. In Avasana, the distinction is between thing on the one hand, being on the other, and then beings in terms of the relationship of essence and existence. Now, using this clarification, this classification, Herrera then argues that there is not and cannot be more than one being that is necessary in itself, and that this necessary being is the cause of all other beings, the cause of all things. He'll frequently refer to it. This necessary and unique being, as he calls it, he also says this is the biblical God. Therefore, and he subsequently argues to add these various properties, it is simple and incomposite, it is incorporeal, infinite, and an absolute unity. The Kabbalists, he says, refer to this entity as Ein Sof, that is without boundary or limit. It is absolutely unlimited or infinite and purely simple. And he concludes his description in chapter 2 then with the following very short description. He says, and the being of all others, that is all other things other than his necessary being, depends on the primal being as numbers depend on the mathematical one. Solar rays on the sun and streams on their source, because all being that participates in another finite being depends on the essential self-subsistent and infinite being, which is the first cause. So any being that exists depends, it may be caused by other beings to be in the state it's in and for its existence, but ultimately it's all through this first cause. This first cause is then one unique and individual, simple, perfect, and sufficient. It cannot communicate its nature directly to any other being, that is, to many. Okay? Nor is it composite in any way or limited, rather it is infinite and pure and good. And it is identical with what the Kabbalists call Ein Sof, but as he points out, in Platonic and Aristotelian terms, should also be called the first cause or the cause of all things. Now, it's against this background that Herrera, in Book 3, Chapter 1, now sets out 13 arguments for a principle that is derivable from the Neoplatonic tradition, that from a simple, perfect, and infinite cause, only a simple and most perfect effect can be produced. That is, that from this first cause there must come a single most perfect effect, which is just what the Kabbalists call primordial human being, which is the first kind of concatenation of the Sphirot in its initial form. Now, we need not go over all of the 13 arguments, but it's interesting to hear, first of all, they're not really all arguments. They're frequently just observations that he's making about this principle and its application. The first, for example, argues that from the one, which is pure unity and simplicity, only one most perfect effect can arise, that is the principle applies in this case. Moreover, as the second comment seems to suggest, if the one, that is the good or the first cause, gives rise to multiple effects, these effects should emanate from, in his words, the plurality of ideas and representational species and models that are conceived by and manifest in the divine mind or intellect, and not directly from that divinity or one itself. In short, in the spirit of Plotinus, Plurality is not a direct effect of the one, but rather of the intellect, which is cognition of forms and ideas. Furthermore, the third argument says that if the effects were plural, they would have to differ from one another, and thus would incorporate quantity and substance, in virtue of which they would be distinguishable. Finally, for our purposes, another comment notes that if among things many lead back to a unity in each class or species, the same holds for multiple species, which all lead back to a single cause. But they do so through this first effect, which must be of the same class as they are, and to which they then can be compared. So somehow the first effect has to be a member of the same class as the things that follow from it. And then he says this, he says, they are connected and subordinate to the first most perfect effect, which being homogeneous and of the same class, is the measure and standard of all those others that are more or less perfect in the degree that they approach and draw near to it, participate in it, and more closely resemble it. That is, the first effect, which is also a cause, is also a paradigm or standard in the Platonic sense. And the lower species or forms, as effects, but also themselves paradigms and causes, have the generic features of paradigms or forms to a greater or lesser degree. That is, they not only have greater or lesser of a given property, but they're greater or lesser forms, insofar as they also are causes. The first cause is beyond this status, and the lower species, etc., can't be compared directly with it. Only the first effect can be so compared, and as the first copy or imitation of the first cause, it must be one perfect and infinite to the degree that that's possible among effects, which it is, right? Now, Herrera concludes this summary of 13 comments, arguments, and whatever by formulating their point in Lurianic terms. This is on page 3. This is E on the handout. With this, part of the reason for including this is to indicate his verbosity and also how difficult it is to sometimes keep straight. He loves to use a kind of cascade of adjectives where presumably he's already introduced a term, right? And you're not quite sure whether he has and under what conditions and such. With this, I believe that the intention of our teacher is proved in a kind of ordinary or common fashion. And the distinction made by Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai of happy memory, he's the pseudonymous author of the Zohar, a rabbinic figure, to whom by tradition, I put it in here, the authorship of the Zohar is ascribed. In the Zohar, in the section Parashat Bereshit, that is a commentary on Genesis, and in the Tikkunim, that is the section that complete the commentary, that between the cause of all causes and the cause of causes, the first of which is undoubtedly the uncaused causal agent of everything, Ein Sof, the highly praised one, and the second of which is, as I understand it, the machshava or exalted mind, that's like intellect. There exists Adam Kadmon, the first and highest Keter. Remember, Keter was the highest of the Sefirot. And in summary, the first and most perfect effect of the independent cause of all causes, which by its power and with its cooperation is cause of the lower causes that follow. To summarize in hopefully clearer terms, Herrera takes his arguments to have shown that between the first cause, Ein Sof, and what he calls here the divine intellect or machshava, a Hebrew word for thought, or presumably, I think he thinks of this as identical with the second of the Sefirot, which is Chachma or wisdom, right? Between, therefore, Ein Sof and wisdom, which now stands in for all the rest of the Sefirot, right? That is the Kabbalistic version of the Platonian and Proclean intellect, which has as its context and objects the Platonic forms and everything they represent. There is a first effect that stands in between the two, and this first effect is also the direct cause of that intellect and everything that follows or emanates from it. So that first effect is the primordial man, that is the initial emanation of the sphere. In Book 4, Chapter 2, Herrera takes up this conclusion and provides a summary of those authorities who support it. These authorities are a vast array of medieval philosophers, Renaissance figures, and he actually cites a passage that I'm omitting here from Ficino, a commentary on the Timaeus, that elaborates this picture the way that he sees it. And he comments on Pico and a similar passage from Pico. So he has an enormous number of figures. But I want to skip over that and turn very quickly now to the my plan had been to say something about the objections that he raises to this account. And then he takes virtually 4 books to respond to those, in the course of which he enriches and elaborates on his philosophical picture. The point of it all, however, as I see it, is to isolate the importance of the process of tzimtzum, or contraction at the beginning. This stage between Ein Sof being itself, and he then says that Ein Sof operates according as an act of will. It can't be an act of necessity. It can't be an emanation by necessity, because the what are being emanated and what are being passed on are perfections at different levels that are catered to the level of perfection of the recipients, so to speak. So it has to be intentful. So he says it's the product of divine will. But in the end, it's this whole process depends upon this act of divine self-limitation. This process of divine self-limitation occurs prior to the emanation. If we picture the Lurianic account as a creation narrative, then the Tzimtzum represents how its initial effects, the ultimate grounds of the created world, and all the apparatus required to produce and organize the cosmos, become separated from the first cause, and yet nonetheless continue to be related to it. The account Herrera has developed is a kind of monism, what Franks calls a dependency monism, but it's even probably more like what he calls a derivation, since it's a derivation from the divine being. It's a monism that follows in the footsteps of Proclus, Plotinus, and earlier Platonisms, all of whom were indebted to the Pythagorean and Platonist tradition, and to the Stoics and Aristotle as well, all conceived as part of that same tradition. Now, Herrera seems aware of many of the problems that such an attempt to derive this plurality and the structure of cosmic order, right, that leads to this plurality, how it can come to be out of a single origin that itself is above unity, right? And that there are costs to it. So Herrera himself interprets the imagery of Tzimtzum famously in figurative terms rather than literal terms, as Maimon later did. And he elaborates his figurative reading in the second to the last book chapter of Book 7 in 10 observations. Well, I can't go through the 10 observations. But I think I can say something briefly about them. He begins by saying that Simpson represents the process that facilitates this entire cosmology. And it does so by making possible not only its initiation, but also its hierarchy. In order for the first cause to produce an effect, it must limit itself, he says, by reducing its active force and potency. And he argues that this occurs in two dimensions or two aspects. One way is when the infinite cause reduces its infinite active potency to suit the limited passive potency or passive potentialities of the most elevated possible effect that it can produce, an effect which is of a lower degree of nature, perfection, and rank, he says, than the first cause itself. In short, there were two emanation models that came out of Plotinus. One was that the emanation from the highest principle is always continual, and it depends upon the recipients, so to speak, how much of the light or the emanation or the causal potency is activated. The other model is that there is a diminishing of the potency of the force, and that's actually a function of the original source. And he seems to be combining elements of both of them, but I think the dominant pitch for him is that Simpson represents the diminishing model. Secondly, he says, the infinite first cause diminishes and limits itself by an act of will or mind. He says that is that rather than focusing on its vastness, the first cause can focus on what it can produce, associating what he calls a unique infinity with the limited or defective modes of being of those things that imitate. So Simpson represents this willful, intentional, purposeful, right, stratification in terms of levels of perfection. And what we end up with, in a certain sort of way, with more purposefulness, nonetheless, it's something like what happens in Pythagoreanism when limited and the unlimited or the infinite definite dyad, are interposed between the monad and all the dichotomies. Right? There has to be some mechanism whereby you get pluralization, but also pluralization and hierarchy. Well, the time is when we're going. There are some other components that I could elaborate on more about how he sees Simpson as reflecting all kinds of aspects of this process as a pictorial representational device for representing these, what he considers this philosophical restructuring, right? Now, what lessons might we draw from looking at Maimon on the one hand and then Herrera? Well, it depends on, in approaching the Kabbalah, it depends on who the reader is. At the end of the 17th century, Henry Moore and Anne Conway, for example, turned to the Kabbalah, and in particular to Herrera's book and his account of Adam Kadmon, primordial man, in order to clarify the role of the Christ in Christian theology. And Conway in particular approaches Herrera with anti-Cartesian issues in mind, and with the problem of how the creator and created beings are related to one another without an intermediary. As we've seen, Maimon approached Leibniz, Spinoza, and also the Kabbalah with a similar kind of issue in mind between the immaterial and the material. And it's in this spirit that we might turn to Spinoza. Well, Spinoza seems to sympathize with Herrera on a certain score. He's also concerned about plurality, but nothing like the plurality that Herrera is. The dramatic difference in Spinoza is that there is only one substance, and all the modes are modes of substance. And that post-Cartesian move would make the structure of Herrera's account of the Kabbalah appealing. But its obvious Aristotelian and Platonist background would have simply been too obvious to him, right, for him to adhere to. Now, coming on the scene when, and I'm really near the end, coming on the scene when he does, between Descartes and Leibniz, Spinoza seems to be taking his task to be refining the naturalistic project into a monism that is both internally coherent and grounded in a first principle. But does he yet see a crucial difference that commentators have begun to point out? Already in Herrera, and probably before among the Kabbalists, Tzimtzum, in part, was taken to play a kind of epistemological role. That is, giving human beings some kind of epistemological access to Ein Sof as a mechanism that enables the emergence from something that's hidden into something that is manifest, and manifest to the degree that it can be received. But this is only one minor aspect of Herrera's reading, and not the most compelling. What Spinoza would have missed, I think, is the potential of the concept of Tzimtzum for something deeper and more challenging. The mechanism of Tzimtzum would later be suited for a different purpose. It would serve as a representation for the generation of another self, or I, or first-person perspective, from a given I, and thus enable a process that would lead to an understanding of mutual recognition between persons. Karl Franks has shown how the Fichtean dialectic of the summing follows the pattern of the Tzimtzum. It's a model that has a significant legacy in Western philosophy, in Fichte, after Maimon, in Fichte, in Hegel, and then into a certain degree in a number of 20th century figures, also interested in the interaction between, the encounter between one person and another. In short, Spinoza has a different appreciation for the world as humanly experienced in its relation to the world as grounded in a relation to an absolute first principle than these later thinkers would have. On one occasion, of course, Spinoza does refer to the human perspective, and there are other systematic reasons. The occasion I'm thinking of is in the famous letter to Oldenburg about parts and wholes, where he refers to the individual as like a worm in the blood. But for him, it's just a matter of at one's knowledge and treating the part the same as the whole, and therefore on the inadequacy of the worm's perspective as well, right? This is a far cry from the role that point of view will later come to play in Kant and the German idealists that follow him and those who did it. Thanks very much.
Why don't we take our customary 5-minute break? Come back at 5:21 for questions, scout our talks.
And even Spinoza is very like, optimistic in terms of like, the possibility of an adequate knowledge. If you can have it, you can have the knowledge of godlike knowledge. And instead I was curious of like Maimon instead, that I remember have like a more skeptical view on the possibility of human knowledge. And I was curious throughout this different, so this the question of, what is the position of human being in the cosmos, given this capacity of knowledge, and I don't know, I was curious to know what, Maimon, how Maimon fits with that, tradition that seems to be a little different from, this from my perspective. Yeah.
It's Antonio.
Yes, yes.
First of all, I hope you won't mind this. I'm not a Maimon expert, right?
Yeah.
So.
Neither am I.
So we have somebody who's much more expert in this area than I am. And rather than ask him, however, I want to answer not the specific question, but something about the question that you asked that I think is very, very interesting, and I haven't given it sufficient attention. Okay? My thought in giving a talk with you guys was, could I talk about Herrera in such a way that he would seem philosophically interested? Because unlike other figures like Leibniz and Spinoza, and then later Maimon and Fichte and Hegel, who have a philosophical credibility, right? And more or less so, right? And Conway, we have to earn it, right? Or something like that. Herrera is a big question. Right? There's a Hebrew book written on him. There's a German book on the whole period, but it only has a chapter that deals with Gate of Heaven and just impressionistically. So we don't have anything. There is a wonderful article by Alexander Altman on Platonism in the Kabbalistic key. And it seemed to me that the few things that have been written about Kabbalah and Neoplatonism have tended to be very impressionistic. Say things like, well, in the Kabbalistic system, there's Ein Sof, the Sfirot, and then our world, right? So what's that like in Neoplatonism, right? Or, how does that look when we set it alongside of Proclus or something like that? So, and as I was reading Herrera with Paul, and we read it, it took us a long time to get through the book, the kind of cosmological and structural features seem to take a pretty prominent role. Now, there are chapters in there that discuss not the descent of the process, but the ascent, the human process of practices and prayer, and what understanding of the cosmological process and the connection to the Sfirot and how that assists the life of practice, the human being in their ascent, right, to return to divinity in some sense. Okay. Now, I don't think that Herrera was oriented that. You might say that practical Kabbalah doesn't play as big a role for him, and certainly not what you might call a humanistic Kabbalah. There are figures later who do focus on human experience. For example, in the 18th century, Moses Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, was a Messianic Jewish rabbi, young guy in the early part of the 18th century, who was a Kabbalist. He wrote a couple of different works on Kabbalistic themes, but he was also an advocate of Jewish ethics and practical experience, and a focus on what we would think of as kind of virtues and cultivating virtues in a humane life and such things. His most famous work is called The Paths of the Righteous, right? And it's a very elaborate account of different virtues that should be cultivated and how they should be integrated in a certain way. Now, recently, Paul spent some time and shows, I think brilliantly, that that work is steeped in the spiatic structure, even though it never mentions it. Right? But it's a very humanistic work. I mean, this is really humanistic Kabbalah, right? So it de-emphasizes the ascetic or transcendent, aspirational side of things in favor of what is bequeathed to the human being. Later in the 19th century, one of the probably the most prominent student of the Talmudist Elijah of Vilna, a man named Chaim of Volozhin, the founder of the first great Jewish academy in the 19th century, wrote a book called Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Chaim, and it starts with a Kabbalistic picture in the first chapter that shows how the human being is a kind of culmination of the creative process, right? And then it takes off from that to argue that the proper Jewish life is to perform the mitzvot, the divine commandments, and ethical and ritual and whatever, and lead a humane and righteous and sanctified life, right? So it uses the Kabbalah and then take as its springboard is basically a humanistic kind of document. So while Maimon was a crank, I mean, he's so difficult. People found him very difficult to deal with as a human being. And of course, he ran out on his wife and kids and such. There were extenuating circumstances. So I can't speak to Maimon, but I can say that I think I shouldn't forget that when you step back and place the role that Kabbalah might play in Western religious thought and philosophy after the 17th century, that it's a really interesting and significant question. How much it focuses on the ethical life, broadly speaking, and how much it is not as oriented around this cosmology. Now, it occurred to me after I finished, because I left out a great deal. It's okay because I have this funny feeling that it was just a lot more trees and not enough forests, that Herrera, think of it this way. Maimon came to the Kabbalah with certain interests as a young man. And then after the acquaintance with Kant, saw that a whole set of problems, mind, body, form, matter, the immaterial and material, the problem of creation, all of these things are the same problem. I remember when Freud first told me about this, I said, that's the Platonic problem of participation in the first part of Parmenides. I mean, this is a problem that once you have established a kind of metaphysical distinction between soul or mind or whatever, and the physical world, or the ideal or the abstract and the then you've got a problem of understanding how they're related to one another. And the Neoplatonists thought that you could take Aristotle and simply mix him into Plato. So you could end up with one kind of battle, right? Herrera doesn't see that problem. That's not Herrera's problem at all. Herrera's problem is still the old problem of multiplicity, right? That's the biggest problem. It's multiplicity, and then it's hierarchy. And the question, why isn't it that God couldn't have created every individual? An occasionalism or something. Right?
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, so this is like simpler, I'm sure, than like. So I want to say back to you like what I was getting from some of this, and so with apologies and in advance. But so. In the initial step, God wanted to create a world to reveal those of his properties that are intended for beings other than himself. You might have before this intervention, you have, just like, if you're limitless triple of God, not much opportunity to display mercy and right, balance between the two, you know, insight and wisdom, you know, the foundation, like reflecting up like higher things and material things, all these things, right? If you're omniscient, not much call for logical deduction or flashes of insight. If you're, you know, perfect God, right? Not much call for charity, etc. Right? So that we have, so you need to contract so that there's something is lacking and split up into multiple beings, so things can be kind or whatever. But then if I'm taking it right, it's like, well, that's actually, there's that account of multiplicity still leaves you with a question, because it's a little bit slightly question begging, because we still have the multiplicity of virtues, the different Seth wrote. And where are those coming from? And then we have the Kantian movement being like, oh, maybe it's something about the way the mind is conceiving of things. God is one, and then we're conceiving of it as like, oh, this is kindness, this is, you know, might, this is the balance between them, yada yada. But then, and so then the like first emanate, the like first cause, the first effect of the human mind is like added as an extra intermediary to handle that. So it's like you have the sort of neo-Carnathian like term where it's like, oh, you can like conceptualize, the human mind can conceptualize perfection in terms of separate virtues. Anyhow, like, so I was like, so I was just so I'm sure that that's not fair, but like entirely fair to what you're saying, but I wonder like how much of that is reduction? Sorry, like the question is, yeah, and if that's like totally irrelevant to it, then replace that with the question, what if the like sort of think about the like gods and chariots and like new Platonism, right? Like the people that follow behind Jove and Mars and all that. Could that be a sort of analog to the like separate, right? We have these different sort of flavors of excellence that the different lovers like to be reminded of. And anyhow, sorry, I do something totally different in philosophy, so I'm not well equipped to ask this question as crisply as I would like, but hopefully at least I rambled long enough for better or worse.
I don't, I'm still trying to figure out exactly which problem or what the problem is that you're concerned about.
Okay, so that's
I
not the problem.
I will say this, there were certain, with regard to both of the figures that I talked about, Maimon, whom I said very little about beyond just his reading of this Kabbalistic material, in light of the fact that he took it to be Spinozism, and he felt that you could give a philosophical elucidation of the ideas that were behind it. I gave him a lot of growth, right? So there were certain questions that I didn't want to raise. I just wanted to show that he came with a certain set of concerns. They were philosophically motivated, and then I think after he was acquainted with Kant and began to think through his own philosophical commitments, then they registered in a certain way. Then I turned to Herrera. Once again, he's very syncretistic. He's just using stuff from a lot of people. It's very hard to figure out which of the stuff that he's using from these people is valuable for the problems that he's trying to address. I took him to be addressing the problem of multiplicity. He says various different things in different places about different kinds of multiplicity. And there are certain, with respect to the Kabbalah, he takes the Kabbalah as a teaching, as a given, right? So there are, not only are there the 10 Sfirot for him in the Lurian and Kabbalah, but this whole thing is so ramified that we have, innumerable levels of manifestation, innumerable sets of interactions, terms that are sometimes used in one sense, sometimes used in another sense. And I didn't want to address any of that, partly because I don't know enough to say anything intelligent about it. Secondly, I just, have yet to figure out what's philosophically interesting about all of that, right? And I asked myself, what is it that is motivating Herrera? I think it is particularly these issues that just came up. Plurality and the issue of the hierarchy and the issue of the form that emanative causality takes.
Okay. I'm sorry, Jay. I know Adam has to go soon, so do you mind if I?
That's fine.
This is all just misdirection. Fine.
Okay, thank you. So the way I'm understanding this with both Herrera and Maimon, they're focused on a kind of a how does it work question. And I think this was pretty clear in what you were just saying about Herrera, right? It's a sort of a how do you get the plurality? Like, so how do you understand how you get from one to the other? How does it work? Another kind of question you can ask is a kind of explanatory question. Why? And this is on my mind because whenever I try to teach Descartes, we get to the third meditation, and we've got this God that's supposed to be perfect and complete in itself. And students always say, well, why would it create anything? And then I kind of flounder around and say something about a creative outpouring, and I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't feel like I have a good answer. And so what I'm wondering is whether the thinkers in the Kabbalistic tradition have an answer to the why question.
Yeah, they do.
And in the text here, it seems to be about, in Herrera, he says, supreme goodness and greatness by which it wishes to be communicated and revealed to others. And Maimon says, wanted to create a world to reveal those of his properties that were intended for beings other than himself, or intended by whom, presumably himself. But then that seems to just invite the same question. Why? That this being is, I take it they're conceiving of the being as perfect and complete in itself at the beginning. So then why does it want to communicate anything to others, share anything with others? Like what's the explanatory story that they would say?
It won't surprise you, but I don't have anything to say about this except point to some things that I'm sure you and some others in the room are very familiar, right? So in the Platonist tradition, the standard thing is turn back to the Timaeus, where the Demagogus is said to be ungrudging, right? It doesn't hold anything back, it doesn't, right? Now, I mean, from one point of view, that looks like it just begs the question, but for a lot of people in a tradition, it indicates, particularly if you take the time and put it together with the public sense, and you know what the ungrudgingness means is this is the good, right? Because the same being that's the creator God for that Platonist until some much later, of course, with Platonism, is the creator God, the one, the good, right? And then the symposium passage about how beauty seeks to overflow, right? And it seeks to express itself, right? To go beyond itself. Now, I think for a lot of people, answers like that made a lot of sense. And I think that's the kind of background that these are reflecting on. Herrera particularly says it's the mind and the will, right? Well, what he means is that it's a purposive act, right? He doesn't want it to sound automatic, right? That it's just natural necessity or physical necessity, something like that. Why? Because it's structured in terms of degrees of perfection or goodness, right? We're also talking about traditions that struggle to find, what grounds the existence of evil. I mean, in Plotinus, it's prime matter, but then it's not really that. It's what people are responsible for because the will has a certain kind of control and things like, and the same sort of thing in Proclus, that he denies that prime matter, right, is the ground of evil. It's that their understanding of goodness as a perfection is that it has no needs, but it seeks to express itself in every way. And if there is nothing else but it, then the first act of expressing the goodness is to bring other than it into being. Right? And then a lot of other things happen, right? It becomes more dialectical, all kinds of stuff. That's the best I can do. I mean, I don't, I've read a lot of this stuff, and I don't see them going anyplace else. It's amazing if you read stuff on particularly the ancient Platonist tradition. It's sometimes you read the secondary literatures and people are finding incredible new insights, right, about a certain figure, when it's just the old answers again and again, right? Right? It's almost as if, we turned, what you need to do to get a credential into a credential. Right? Keep working at it, working at it. That is a certain view of goodness.
Yeah.
And also privation and negation, right? You have to understand evil in a certain way.
Yeah.
And then they don't say, well, and then it comes back to, can you live this? Right, let's say. Or something like that. I don't remember anybody that comes immediately to mind. Right? Yes, can you accept this? But the Kabbalists are so devoted to the meticulous implementation of the mind's focus on all the systematic connections that will allow you to act in such a way that you are basically activating the divine being. Right? That
Sure. Thank you very much for the talk. I think this question is like a mixture of like curiosity and also clarification, I think, because I'm thinking about this emanation as it moves down, it's adapted and accommodated to the inferior one. So as we get farther, there's a kind of distance that's that emerges in. And I'm wondering if the solution, if this system is supposed to this monism is supposed to resolve the problem of why our categories are reliable for objectives are reliable. And there's also this kind of implicit inferiority to them as well. I guess my question is, how does this resolve the problem that it was meant to resolve in the first place? Or is its way of doing it by saying we have to begin from this grand metaphysical picture and then we can kind of elucidate why our categories are reliable, where the Kantian picture tries to do it from the other side and then says, oh, now our categories, there is a question of how we can adjudicate knowledge about God. So I guess the question is, how does is it possible to misunderstand if we're down this line of this inferior kind of down these emanated lines, is it possible to misunderstand the divine light, given that we're in this inferior down the gradations? And if so, what does that misunderstanding amount to? What are we misunderstanding? What's causing the misunderstanding of the divine light?
Behind your question is something that I'm very baffled with about this whole this picture. Okay. If you imagine, well, first of all, there are those in the Kabbalistic tradition who have a view that's very close to, but not explicitly acosmic. That is, they really think that all there is divinity, and everything else is just appearance, and perhaps less than that, illusion, and whatever, right? So it's a matter of greater and greater understanding, but the understanding is itself a project within a world of illusion, okay? There are those who are quite committed to that, right? But there's the other problem of how do we get what is it in the emanator process that constitutes the next deficient level, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. There's this talk about the light pouring out of Ein Sof through Adam Kadmon and the Sfirot that shines on, which means reveals to and shapes, right? Because this process is providential, but it also, from human beings' point of view, it's active and cognitive and emotional, etc. And what makes the degrees less deficient? And when sometimes the Kabbalists, they use this language of a veil, or sometimes of thickening, right? As if it were more like a cloud than a light or something at a certain level. And they're trying to articulate this process of structuring these modes of deficiency. This, and I don't recall reading in the Kabbalistic stuff that I've read anything that helps me to understand how the divine emanation both does that and then emanates into it, so to speak, right? Because I could say that the answer to your question is one of perspective limitation, right? It's not, sometimes it's self-limitation in our daily lives about making mistakes and seeing things incorrectly or being persuaded by certain ways of looking at things rather than others or something like that, or being unable to control our emotions or feelings in certain states and things like that. But there's a cosmological account that should be there, right, about how that happens, right? And I don't know that the literature fully enough to say in any detail why they think that's so, right? Why we are limited in just that way, why we don't, why things aren't revealed to us in just that way. I mean, why don't all of us have a great mathematical ability? Why aren't we all good at science? Why aren't we all good, you know? I don't recall anything that would help me, but that's maybe my lack of understanding. I've been struggling with this for the last few years, trying to master it enough to ask the larger questions about why some of the historical figures that I'm interested in find value in certain motifs and, conceptual structures, why they had the kind of impact, why they were extractable. I mean, this business about contraction may be the answer to all of it. It may be that all you need to say is the contraction is not, there was this tradition that goes back to at least the late 16th century about this business of symptom and contraction. But there were those who read it literally and those who read it figuratively. They called it pseudo and low kipshuto. Kipshuto is on the surface, or just read what the words say, the simple meaning. And then the low kipshuto is anything else. And by and large, the anything else usually meant philosophical influence. And somebody was trying to read it according to certain philosophical concepts. And reading it, therefore, sort of structurally, which is more what Herrera does, right? But it's there to cover a lot of sins. There's original symptom, and then there are an infinite number of symptoms, and every single level of exposure. And the worlds that they talk about are themselves simply collections of vast numbers of serial levels of diminishing, right? That is also exposure, right? So it's a motif that's meant to capture that. So I presume it might be that a really fully schooled Kabbalist at a certain point would say, we are the frail and beings that we are, making the mistakes that we do because creation required divine purpose, but also divine self-limitation. And that's a kind of metaphor for that fact, right? That we are finite and therefore we're limited. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, I don't know the answer.
Sure.
Yeah, that was a perfect setup for my question, actually, because let me first preface this by saying this may be a mistake, but I thought you were suggesting that Herrera could be read as someone who wants to go beyond the talk of mere figurative reading and give it a kind of explanation, or give it a kind of clearer formulation, the figurative reading of the truth.
Oh,
And
oh,
I thought you were suggesting that in his theorizing about cause and the hierarchy of causes, there was going, well, cause doesn't sound like metaphor or figurative talk, right? That's something it seemed like we're aware of, at least in our finite way, among objects in our world. And it sounds like theory talk, not figurative or metaphor talk. So I was taking Herrera's speculations, 3 ways of trying to say, well, okay, shrinking doesn't mean, God creates this big vast space by shrinking to a dot or anything. That's just all figurative. It means something else. It's the limitations that go into the story about cause. Am I on track, sort of?
yeah.
Okay, but if that's right, that's where I start to wonder, because what he says, as you point out, and I'm just quoting now, this is from G. The infinite first cause is so superior and sovereign that all the other effects are not able to receive it directly unless it is through the mediation of the first one and its doors, windows, channels, and apertures, which are blah, blah, blah. Which again, it's more metaphor. And what I wonder is there something in the writing that suggests that he's aiming at a kind of clarity about what he's saying? So, for example, here's what I would have in mind. I'm not too ambitious here. I'm just thinking, like, okay, maybe there are things we're familiar with, perhaps human beings causing events, where we would describe it as a superior cause, then interacting in a way that's limited and initiating an inferior series of events, and that we could move up by analogy or something, maybe up the hierarchy, or at least imagine what it would be to move up the hierarchy. Is there anything like that? Because without it, just starting at the top, it seems to me that we don't have any understanding of what he's saying.
All right. Is the issue whether this philosophical, what I call elucidation,
Yeah.
right, counts as more than a redescription?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think you're right. I think that he believes that it makes it clear,
Yeah.
right? That, and that's, I think, in part why he's doing it, because he thinks that the philosophical literature has explored certain issues about causality, about this issue of creation or eternity,
Right.
and the existence of a first principle or first cause. And philosophy has clarified it in a way that the Kabbalah simply depicts in terms of images, right? So I think he does believe that it's clear. Now, a lot of his discussion, or the literature that he appropriates, has to do with this cosmological structure as it manifested itself in Neoplatonism and then in other figures, right, who were writing about it. And what he's done is he sees places where they have explored a certain, I think, part of the structure in a way that he feels is revealing about where he thinks there's a problem. So, for example, I think the passage that you were referring to is one of those passages where it becomes clear that his concern is he's got a few issues that really seem to worry him. The one is this principle that from a simple perfect cause you can only get a single simple perfect outcome or effect. And he wants to show why that's necessary, because he thinks that this Adam Kadmon configuration in the Kabbalah serves that purpose, but also why it serves some structural purpose in terms of the causal or emanative process. So he cites some passages where that confirm that principle, but then he cites some passages why there are still issues about plurality and further mediation and things of that nature. And then he finds passages in various figures that have dealt with that and he feels illuminated, right? But they're not always in the right place. So, and like the passage that you read, I'm sure he felt, even though that it was that particular place where of distance of the windows, he slipped into imagery that he was really talking about the fact that the structure of the process is by degree and hierarchical, and at any given level, the amount of causal effect that has effect depends on the passive potency or passive potential of the item in question, which is a principle that goes back to Aristotle and was reinterpreted by Neoplatonists, that there's active potential and then there's passive potential. And so he takes these passages, a passage of that nature, and says, well, that articulates this principle that it depends not only on the active potential of the cause, but on the passive potential of the effect.
Okay, so maybe if I'm understanding you right, I was making a mistaken assumption that he was trying to build up from things we're familiar with independently to an understanding of the theorizing about cause. He's not doing that. He's like this. He's taking the Kabbalah as an implicit theory, and he's trying to help us understand this.
Yes, it's more like that.
So like there's this primitive notion of cause that's embedded in the Kabbalah somehow, and it's highly theoretical, and we're slowly coming to grips with it. And then if we do, we see this hierarchy of cause. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and that's why I use the language of representation, right? He takes the Kabbalah to be a representation, a religious representation of a certain metaphysical, philosophical understanding of the cosmic order. So he takes creation for granted, but he doesn't do a lot of the things that typically are debated about creation. About whether it could have happened at an earlier time. He doesn't use any of the standard tropes that are around. He just takes that for granted. Maimon, on the other hand, says, look, there are these problems. You simply can't take creation seriously. So let's just read it figuratively and go from there in a different direction.
Okay.
So yeah, he thinks the Kabbalah is a theory. Now, I don't know whether Spinoza would have taken it that way, right? I think Spinoza is working out what people have written about Spinoza and Kabbalah have said a couple of things. One is they've said, well, Spinoza has something like Ein Sof, that is a first principle. But Spinoza's first principle is God or nature, or the necessarily existing self, right, which is unique or whatever. Well, is that Ein Sof? Is that really an embedded? Spinoza has a notion of an intellect, God's intellect, right, as an infinite mode, right? This model also has an intellect, right? Well, I found that that's not helpful at all to say that Spinoza's indebted to the Kabbalah for those kinds of reasons. That didn't help at all. Recently, someone, Yitzhak Melamed at Johns Hopkins has argued that there's a passage in an appendix to the short treatise where Spinoza looks like he's using the language of divine withdrawal. Once again, I alluded to this. Finding a term that looks like it's something similar with no context in which it even makes any sense, that's a pointless enterprise. What do you get from that, right? So what I was thinking was that if Spinoza had this work, which was written about the time he was born, and so when he was a teenager, it was circulating, and what rabbi he knew was translating in the Hebrew, if he was reading it and seeing the philosophical terminology being used to elucidate the Kabbalah, would he have found any of that of value? And the way I thought of approaching it was, well, what would be his philosophical motivations for finding something valuable, right? Would he be interested in the plurality question? Well, it looks a little bit like the question that asked of Spinoza, why are there finite modes at all? Right? Right? But it doesn't get answered in anything like the same way, if you think about it, even in a simplistic way, because according to Herrera, it's purposeful and generates a hierarchy of perfection or goodness or something like that. None of that is anything that Spinoza takes seriously. He doesn't take creation seriously. He doesn't take religious language to be more than ideology, basically, right? So I thought it was also a kind of a way of exposing why one might be valuable in Herrera. But I think the point, it's hard to synthesize what he is really saying about this cosmological structure. I tried to give a few passages that are on there we didn't even read, where he seems to allow a little bit more filling out, but never is it using one terminology or the other. It's always these combined in a way that makes it very difficult to grasp, okay? And yet, Herrera had his influence on Anne Conway, and there were some later figures in New York and John Semple.
Yeah, and I know we're past the hour, but so this will have to be the last question. So I'm sorry, Tim.
Just answered my question, his final riff about Spinoza. I was wondering.
Oh,
okay, so perfect.
Okay. Frederick?
Yeah, so you might just answer my question as well, so this may be quick, but I was wondering about a cosmologism as well, so it's somewhat related to Jag's question. So I take it your reading of Herrera is that he's concerned with this primarily with this question about multiplicity. How do we get many things from one?
plus the hierarchy.
Yeah, so the hierarchy stuff is what I'm interested in. So in Spinoza, I take it, he takes himself to have a pretty good answer to the question of multiplicity, from the definition of an infinite attribute, and infinitely many things follow. But with regard to the question about how do we get the finite from the infinite, Spinoza is much more cagey. You can read those propositions about how we get the infinite modes, where you might take them to just imply that anything that follows from the attribute of an infinite substance has to itself be infinite, and then there's worry, well, where are the finite things coming from? Does Herrera have a kind of direct way of responding to this worry about how we get the finite from the infinite? Is the hierarchy stuff just supposed to be a response to that question?
Well, it's not exactly. It's more. There's that one passage, I either read it or alluded to it, where he says there are different kinds of multiplicity. The multiplicity of species, there's a multiplicity of particulars, and the multiplicity of composition, parts of the thing and whatever. And all of these flow from, right, the highest, well, once you get any multiplicity, right, that is any capacity to distinguish what counts as an individual at a certain level, let's say, or something like that. And he just leaves it at that, right? Because I think he thought that was widely accepted, that the real problem in something like Platonism is how you get intellect with multiplicity. From there on in, it's not much of a problem, because once the content of the intellect is the forms, then you, right, and they're distinguishable, they're different. Once you get sameness and difference, you can just run with it. I don't recall any place where he does anything more specific, but believe me, that doesn't mean it's not there.
Mhm.
Right, it's that kind of a book. It's frustrating in that respect. You don't know, he doesn't help you to see what he's bringing forward from him doing it. So I had to construct something.
I think we're gonna have to stop there for these short games.